Do you solemnly swear that you will justly, truly, fairly, and impartially act as an interpreter in the case now before the court?
The key element for an interpreter is that you have to be accurate in your translation.
Bueno, yo no sabía si Juan estaba por allí, así que bajé al restaurante a ver si estaba trabajando.
Well, I didn't know if Juan was around, so I went down to the restaurant to see if he was working.
In United States federal courts, it's essential that defendants understand the proceedings. This is true whether or not the defendant speaks or understands the English language.
Do you understand the charges which the government has brought against you?
你明白检察官对你的起诉吧？
我明白。
I understand.
Accurate interpreting is very important in court proceedings. Court interpreters help the court be an impartial evaluator of the facts in a proceeding. The role of the interpreter in court has been prescribed by law in the Court Interpreters Act. That law says that the court shall use an interpreter when a party, including a defendant in a criminal case or a witness, speaks only or primarily a language other than the English language, so as to inhibit such parties' comprehension of the proceedings or communication with counsel. Court interpreters put a non-English speaking defendant on an equal footing with an English speaking defendant.
Correct.
Please state your full name.
请把你的名字说出来。
我的名字叫王英。
My name is Yang Wang.
Where do you live?
你在哪里住？
我住在 Springfield West Street 1222号。
I live on 1222 West Street, Springfield.
Do you understand that you are now under oath, that you must answer all my questions truthfully, and that if you do not tell the truth in response to my questions, you can be prosecuted for perjury, and your false answers can be used against you if you are prosecuted for perjury?
Language is the primary form of communication in a court, and so court interpreters make it possible for a non-English speaking defendant to participate in the proceedings that will help determine his or her guilt or innocence.
It charges that on or about April 25th of last year, you, Ying Wan, unlawfully and knowingly received and possessed a firearm shipped in interstate commerce.
这个起诉书说，在去年4月25号左右，你王英被起诉是不合法，而且明明晓得拥有枪支，把枪带到别的州去。
Do you understand the charges which the government has brought against you?
你明白检察官对你的起诉吧？
我明白。
I understand.
You have the right to the assistance of a lawyer at all stages of these criminal proceedings, and if you're unable to afford one, the court will assign one to you. Do you understand this?
你明白，在刑事案子整个过程，你有权利聘请一个律师代表你。如果你没有钱去请律师的话，法庭可以指派一个律师代表你。
我明白。
I understand.
Interpreters should become familiar with court terminology because the meaning of some words can be different from ordinary usage. You should inquire whether your court has a glossary of frequently used terms. Because the interpreter enables the non-English speaking defendant to participate in court proceedings, it's important that you know the proper procedure for interpreting in court. And also understand that there are rules that govern what interpreters do. Federal Rule of Evidence 604 requires the interpreter to take an oath to faithfully and impartially interpret the speech of the witness or defendant. It's a great responsibility, says Kevin Devaney, a professional interpreter with 15 years' experience in court interpreting.
Interpretation is very important because the role of the interpreter is to allow the evidence to come out, and that is the basis on which important decisions are made that affect the defendants. All parties depend on the interpreter, and if they do not have confidence in the interpreter, then the communication will be less effective. The key element for an interpreter is that you have to be accurate in your translation. You should not be omitting things, you should not be adding things.
The impartiality of the court governs interpreters' behavior. For example, interpreters are never to take sides in any matter for which they are interpreting.
Whatever opinion an interpreter has is an opinion that should be kept to himself or herself, and you should avoid any way in giving any indications as to what your opinion may be. After that, there's the issue of confidentiality. An interpreter really should not repeat to any other party what they hear in the courtroom. You really should go to all lengths possible to maintain yourself as an independent and impartial party. And if you were to give statements that might tend to show bias one way or the other.
Impartiality affects interpreters in other ways, too.
Among other things, this implies that you shouldn't be accepting payment from anyone except the court for work done in the courtroom.
Some, but not all, courts have equipment to facilitate and improve the quality of interpretation and give the interpreter more flexibility. With an infrared system, which can be portable or fixed, the interpreter listens to the courtroom PA system. The interpretation is carried by way of an infrared beam from a control box to a small headset worn by the defendant. It's the same principle as a remote control for a television set. Another advantage of such equipment is that the interpreter is physically removed from the defendant, which reduces the possibility of the defendant initiating casual conversation with the interpreter. In the courtroom, the judge presides over the conduct of the proceedings. He or she maintains order and makes rulings on points of law. The attorney representing the government, which has brought charges against the defendant, sits at a table facing the judge's bench. The defendant and his attorney sit at another table. In a jury trial, the jury decides the facts of a case based on the presentation of evidence and the testimony of witnesses. In a bench trial, there is no jury. It is the judge who decides the facts. Witnesses testify about the facts that are in dispute. They testify from a witness stand, which faces both parties. Testimony is part of the permanent record of the proceeding. This record ensures that there can be no doubt about what occurred in the courtroom. The record is made by electronic sound recording or taken down by a court reporter.
Tell us when you were employed, during what period of time?
Díganos cuándo fue que estuvo empleada, durante qué periodo de tiempo.
Desde el marzo hasta septiembre.
From March to September.
Was it last year you worked for Mr. White, from March to September?
¿Fue el año pasado que trabajó para el señor White de
Sí.
marzo a septiembre? Yes.
Sí.
Yes.
And where was it that you worked?
¿Y dónde fue que trabajó?
Tenía una pequeña oficina auxiliar en su casa y a veces me hizo trabajar ahí.
He had a small office at home and sometimes he had me work there.
How often did you work there?
¿Cuán a menudo trabajó allí?
Quizás 1 o 2 veces al mes.
Perhaps once or twice a month.
It is the interpreter's rendition in English at the witness stand that is taken down, not what the witness says in the source language. Judges and juries base their decisions about witnesses' testimony as rendered by a third party, the interpreter. That is why accurate interpretation is so important. In fact, in some cases, the court may also record the interpreter's and defendant's words in the source language, if the judge determines that it's necessary to ensure the rights of the defendant. Another important person in the courtroom is the courtroom deputy, who helps the judge keep things moving smoothly. This person sits below the judge, marks evidence, and administers oaths to witnesses and interpreters.
The United States versus Ying Wan.
The deputy will swear the interpreter.
Please state your name for the record.
Good morning, Your Honor. Bruce Chen, C-H-A-N.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that you will justly, truly, fairly, and impartially act as an interpreter in the case now before the court?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Now, we're starting this trial today. The motions have been resolved. Ms. Brown, are you ready for the government?
I am, Your Honor.
Mr. Reynolds, are you ready for the defendant, Ying Wan?
Yes, Your Honor.
Once sworn in, the interpreter is an officer of the court.
An interpreter is considered an officer of the court because there is that relationship of an oath that is stated to the court, to the judge, in front of all of the parties. The exact wording can vary from courthouse to courthouse, I believe, but it generally includes the elements of impartiality and accuracy.
Because interpreters must give an accurate rendition of what is being said, they need to sit or stand where it's possible to hear and see the defendant, witnesses, attorneys, and the judge. This will, of course, depend on whether audio equipment is available.
The interpreter really must let the the presiding judge know that there is a difficulty in hearing. It affects the performance of the job. We have to make sure that the record is complete and accurate as to the testimony, and you shouldn't feel any shyness about letting the presiding judge know.
For the record, it must be clear whether it is the interpreter speaking or asking a question, or the person whose speech is being interpreted. So when addressing the judge, the interpreter always refers to himself or herself in the third person.
I was driving Fred Smith's car.
Please tell the court how you came to be driving Mr. Smith's car.
Por favor, dígale al tribunal cómo fue que usted terminó conduciendo el carro del señor Smith.
Me lo prestó para poder visitar a mi hermano.
He loaned it to me so I could visit my brother.
And where does your brother live?
¿Y dónde vive su hermano?
En Santa Fe.
In Santa Fe.
Did Mr. Smith know that's where you're going to be driving his car?
Your Honor, the interpreter wasn't able to hear all of counsel's last question. Could he request that it be repeated?
Yes. Ms. Chin, would you please repeat your question?
Also note that judges are always addressed as Your Honor.
Certainly, Your Honor. Did Mr. Smith know you were going to drive his car to Santa Fe?
In most cases, only the English rendition of testimony in a second language becomes part of the permanent court record. Testimony is oral evidence given by a witness or the defendant under oath, as opposed to non-testimony, such as the judge's comments during a hearing. The Court Interpreters Act requires testimony in a second language to be interpreted in the consecutive mode, except the judge may authorize simultaneous interpretation of testimony if it will aid the efficient administration of justice. This exception can only be made after a hearing on the record, otherwise both questions and answers are interpreted consecutively.
What happened next after you had checked into the hotel?
¿Y entonces qué ocurrió después de que se registró en el hotel?
Bueno, no sabía si Juan estaba por allí, así que bajé al restaurante a ver si estaba trabajando.
Well, I didn't know if Juan was around, so I went down to the restaurant to see if he was working.
And did you find him there?
¿Y lo encontró allí?
No, no lo encontré. Les pregunté a varios empleados, inclusive al barman, pero nadie lo había visto.
No, I didn't find him. I asked several of the staff, including the bartender, but no one had seen him.
And what did you do then?
¿Y entonces qué hizo?
Pues suponía que tarde o temprano tenía que regresar, así que me comí algo.
Well, I supposed that sooner or later he had to come back, so I had something to eat.
Do you remember what you had for dinner?
¿Recuerda usted lo que cenó?
Sí, una ensaladita y una parmesana de berenjena y un té helado.
All of the witness's words must be interpreted. The interpreter must not paraphrase or summarize what the witness says. What we'll hear next is an incorrect example of interpretation.
And how long were you in the restaurant?
¿Y cuánto tiempo estuvo en el restaurante?
No lo van a creer. Estaba tan lento. Tomó casi una hora para que llegara la comida. Después, para que comí, para que pedir cheque, para que pedir sencillo. Yo estaba allí, debe haber sido... Bueno, yo estaba allí por lo menos 2 horas.
I was there 2 hours.
The interpreter is not to summarize or paraphrase what is said. Let's watch this same testimony again to hear how it must be interpreted.
And how long were you in the restaurant?
¿Y cuánto tiempo estuvo en el restaurante?
Uy, no lo van a creer. Estaba tan lento. Tomó casi una hora para que llegara la comida. Después, que comí, que pedir cheque, que pedir sencillo. Yo estaba allí, debe haber sido... Bueno, yo estaba allí por lo menos 2 horas.
Oh, you won't believe it was so slow. It took almost an hour before I got my meal. Then by the time I ate, got my check, asked for my change, I was there, it must have been, well, I was there at least 2 hours.
The Court Interpreters Act requires that everything else, such as testimony in English and exchanges between attorneys, be interpreted in the simultaneous mode, except as otherwise directed by the judge. Only the defendant hears this interpretation. As with testimony, everything must be interpreted, and the interpreter may not summarize or paraphrase what is said.
Are there motions?
Yes, there are motions.
And what are the motions?
There are motions of the transcripts of the wiretap.
So we'll have to try the motions. When do you want to try the motions?
¿Cuándo quieren ustedes ver estas mociones?
We could do it the week of
Podríamos
October
hacerlo durante
13th.
la semana del 13 de octubre.
What about the 21st
¿Qué
at
me dice del
4:30?
21 a las 4:30?
That's the week I begin a
Esa
trial
es
of
la
the
semana en
Spalding
que
case.
empiezo el caso Spalding.
Then what if we put it off
Bueno,
until
¿y
next
qué me
month?
dice si lo posponemos
What
hasta
day
el
do you want?
siguiente mes? ¿Qué día quiere?
My calendar is free the second week of that
Tengo el
month.
calendario abierto durante la segunda
can
semana
do
de
it
ese
then
mes.
also with the
Puedo
exception of
hacerlo
Friday that
entonces
week.
también menos el viernes de esa semana.
An accurate rendition of all that is said during a courtroom proceeding requires the interpreter to maintain the level or register of language used by the speaker. The interpreter must, to the fullest extent possible, preserve the style, idioms, and idiosyncrasies of each speaker, reproducing any nuances and ambiguities.
Now, Miss Lopez, you have been to Miss Wolf's home, haven't you?
Ahora, señora López, usted ha estado en la casa de la señora Wolf, ¿no es así?
Sí.
Yes.
How would you describe her home?
¿Cómo describiría su casa?
Pucha, qué casota, tan bonita y con mucha luz. Está bien adornadita, con telas y esculturas súper bonitas y con todo tipo de maquinaria. Ay, está recontra chévere.
Well, her house is really something. Big, so pretty, lots of light, decorated with lots of fabrics and sculptures. Very pretty. It's got every kind of machine. Her house is totally cool.
Our challenge as interpreters is to translate into exactly that same style of language, because we don't have the flexibility. We're not supposed to be able to edit or change what is being spoken, and if we change the level of language, then we change the meaning.
Interpreters must simply convert any source message as is into the target language. Imprecise or awkward language should never be rendered as flawless English, as we'll hear next.
Of course. I didn't want there to be any misunderstanding about that.
What was your reaction to the salary he offered?
¿Y cuál fue su reacción al salario que le ofreció?
Bueno, mucho más mejor de lo que yo esperaba.
Oh, it was much better than I expected.
How much better was it than you had?
Let's listen to the same testimony again and hear how it should be interpreted.
Claro que sí, yo no quería que hubiera ningún malentendido sobre eso.
Of course, I didn't want there to be any misunderstanding about that.
What was your reaction to the salary he offered?
¿Y cuál fue su reacción al sueldo que él ofreció?
Era mucho más mejor de lo que yo esperaba.
It was much more better than I expected.
How much better was it than you had expected?
Even if a witness is evasive, repetitive, unresponsive, or simply makes no sense, the interpreter must render an equivalent version into English.
Please proceed.
Now, Miss Wan,
王女士，
when did you first see the gun on the seat of your car?
你第一次是哪个时候看到这个枪在你这切上这个椅子桌子上头？
我从来就没有枪。
I never had a gun.
But you did see the gun on the seat of your car?
你看过在你切上这个椅子桌子上头有枪？
我从来就没有枪。
I never had a gun.
But if it's not yours, how did the gun get there in your car?
如果不是你的枪，怎么跑到你的切上来？
我从来就没有枪。
I never had a gun.
But Miss Wan, I'm not asking if you own a gun. I'm asking when you saw the gun on the seat of your car.
Even vulgar speech or cursing is to be interpreted.
What the interpreter has to keep in mind is that they have sworn an oath that they are going to faithfully and accurately render what is spoken in the foreign language into English, and you cannot allow your personal feelings get in the way of that. If these are words that you would be uncomfortable uttering out of your own mouth, you have to remember that these are not your own words. You do not own them. Your job is merely to translate them into English.
The interpreter's responsibility is to impartially facilitate communication between the parties. The interpreter is never to edit statements made by witnesses or to say what he or she thinks a defendant or witness means to say. Nor is the interpreter to offer his or her own opinions or feelings about any aspect of the case or proceedings.
At this point, we'll recess for lunch. Be back at 1:30.
All rise.
The interpreter must take no active role even if an attorney or another court officer asks for an opinion.
I'm not sure about our last witness. Tell me, what do you think? Was he telling the truth?
Well, I'm not in a position to say anything about your case.
Well, but surely you have some idea about whether he was believable.
well, it's not appropriate for me to say anything about the case.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
Well, my position does not allow me to say anything about the case.
If the interpreter has a question or needs a clarification or a repetition, he or she must direct that request to the judge, who may in turn ask others to repeat what was said.
You wouldn't consider yourself a friend of Miss Wolf's then, would you?
Usted entonces no se consideraría amiga de la señora Wolf.
No.
No.
But you knew her well enough to know that she had been given a golden parachute last year.
Your Honor, the interpreter is not familiar with the term counsel has used, golden parachute. Could he request that it be explained?
Mr. McCann, would you explain the term golden parachute?
Certainly, Your Honor.
Whenever the interpreter needs to consult the witness about a linguistic issue, the interpreter must always ask permission of the judge.
So you became angry with Miss Wolf when you asked her to go to the neighborhood shop.
Entonces usted se enojó con la señora Wolf cuando le pidió que la acompañara a la tienda del vecindario.
What did she say that made you so angry?
¿Qué fue lo que le dijo que la enojó tanto?
Ay, Dios, eso queda por el quinto infierno.
Your Honor, the interpreter is not quite certain what the witness means by a phrase she's used. Could he inquire so that he can clarify the answer?
Yes, go ahead, please.
¿Qué quiere decir usted cuando dice eso queda por el quinto infierno?
Ay, es una expresión nomás. Quiere decir, es demasiado lejos para ir hacia un sitio tan feo.
It's just an expression. It means it's too far to go to such an ugly place. The interpreter is now ready to continue interpreting testimony, Your Honor.
If the witness or defendant asks for clarification of a question or statement, the interpreter simply interprets the witness or defendant's request for all parties in the courtroom. The interpreter leaves it to the person who posed the original question or made the original statement to explain what he or she meant. The interpreter is not to explain what has been said or asked during a court proceeding.
Now, Miss Lopez, you had testified previously that you had been to Miss Wolf's home, is that right?
Ahora bien, señora López, usted había declarado anteriormente que había ido a la casa de la señora Wolf, ¿no es así?
Sí.
Yes.
How is it you would have been there?
¿Cómo es que usted hubiera estado allí?
¿Qué dice? Yo no entiendo la pregunta. ¿Qué es lo que quiere saber?
What does he mean? I don't understand the question. What does he want to know?
Let me rephrase the question. What I'm asking is, why did you go there previously?
If the interpreter makes an error of interpretation, he or she must correct it as soon as possible.
If you're interpreting for a defendant at the table, then of course it's much easier. You just lean over to the defendant and say, I made a mistake, this is what he said. When it's for a testimony that is being taken down on the record, then you must be very clear to make sure that any errors that you become aware of are corrected. At the very first opportunity, you perhaps would not interrupt a question in the middle of a question, but as soon as there is a pause, you would say, Your Honor, the interpreter has become aware that a mistake was made and a correction needs to be made for the record. And just by doing that should be enough to get the judge's attention, and you should have the opportunity to correct your mistake.
The interpreter who has taken the oath is an officer of the court and is ethically bound to remain neutral. Just the mere appearance of bias could put in question the validity of any proceeding.
你认为这场官司他可以打赢吗？
我肯定可以的。
啊，当然如此。今天天气真好，我真想到外面去这。
天气很好，我们这里这几天都蛮好的。
我想是这样的，我想回去做院子。
哦，你的院子大吧？
很小。
哦，那你种花吧。
The interpreter may be the only person in the courtroom who can understand and talk to a defendant or to a witness. There's a natural human tendency that when you're all alone in a place and there's only one person you can talk to, you want to open up to that person and engage in a very intimate conversation with him or her. But this is to be avoided if we allow ourselves to become involved on a personal level with the defendants or the witnesses. Then our impartiality could come into question by the other party.
In a jury trial, the interpreter can have no contact with any member of the jury. Interpreters should avoid undue conversation with attorneys in any proceeding. It is appropriate for the interpreter to ask attorneys to get information or documentation needed to do a good job. But if a defense or prosecuting attorney asks the interpreter to deliver instructions or review or explain documents to a defendant or witness without the attorney present, the interpreter must respectfully decline.
Quiero comprarme una bolsita de pretzel.
I hope so, but pardon me, I'm starving to death. I'd like to get a bag of pretzels.
Gracias.
Oh, excuse me. You'll be interpreting for our next defense witness who's outside in the hall. He'll refer to these documents. Please take them to him and explain that they're Mr. White's notes so he knows what I'm referring to when I question him.
I'm sorry, Counselor, but I can't do that.
What do you mean you can't do that? I need him to know what these are.
Yes, but it wouldn't be right for me to have such contact with a witness.
But they're just some handwritten notes from the defendant's boss.
But I'm not at liberty to speak to a witness without you being present. It would be inappropriate. As an interpreter, I am to remain impartial.
But listen. Oh, of course, you're right. I'm sorry I asked you to do that.
If any situation or problem comes up that interferes with the interpreter's ability to keep a professional distance, the interpreter should immediately notify the Office of Interpreting Services or the Clerk of Court's office. An interpreter should bring to the judge's attention any time he or she is unable to interpret accurately. For example, if interpreter fatigue begins to affect performance after an extended and uninterrupted period of interpretation.
I will confer with the pretrial services officer today or tomorrow at the latest, and we'll have an answer for you then.
Very well.
Excuse me, Your Honor?
Yes, Ms. Chin, you have a question?
Yes, Your Honor. The defendant asks to be placed in a halfway house while awaiting trial. Detention causes him great anguish. So, for that reason...
In some cases, a court may authorize two interpreters working together and unobtrusively switching off at appropriate intervals.
And what does the government feel about that?
We would ask to deny that request.
Who did the detention hearing?
I believe it was Judge Hanson, Your Honor.
Well, I'm not prepared to rule on that today. File a motion and I'll rule on that. Are there any guns in this case?
No.
And who are the family members?
His father and 2 brothers.
This avoids interrupting the proceedings and preserves the accuracy of the interpretation by preventing interpreter fatigue. The off-mic interpreter should remain in the courtroom and pay attention to the progress of the trial.
Well, as I said, I'm not going to rule on that today. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Your Honor.
This resource is not available in all courts and is within the discretion of the court. This introduction has given you a basic understanding of the interpreter's task and obligation when interpreting in court. Interpreters play an important role in these proceedings.
All of the parties in the courtroom depend on your performance. It isn't just the defendant who may be listening to your simultaneous translation. Every party needs to have a correct translation done so that the judicial process can work in the way it was designed to work.
The accurate and impartial language service interpreters provide helps ensure fairness to all non-English speaking defendants in criminal proceedings and helps the federal courts do their work effectively.